Thank you, Brad. And thanks to Jason as well. So thank you for presenting the summary of the major findings from the study. As Brad mentioned, we will now be presenting a more in-depth view to the data and details of how these conclusions were reached. As mentioned at the start of the webinar, there will be some slight repetition of some of the introductory material in this next session. So we'll ask for your indulgence on that. Thank you very much. I'll now hand it back over to Jason.
Thank you, Diane. Since it was announced by the federal government that there would be the modernization of the Patented Medicines Pricing Review Board, we had concerns what the impacts to both our sector as well as patients would be. So earlier this year, we commissioned a survey of pharmaceutical and other life sciences leaders to see how they believe the PMPRB changes will impact their operations in Canada. The respondents were unanimous on the negative impacts. And nearly all believe that the reforms will impact, in particular, new medicine launches in Canada. So this is what our companies have told us, and it's what inspired us to continue to follow and track and further investigate this really important issue. Also, the federal health minister has continued to claim that many countries with lower prices have faster access to new medicines, and that despite the changes to the PMPRB, they expect innovators of new medicines to continue to launch their products in Canada at the same rate that they currently do today. The federal government has not provided any substantive analysis to support this position. As a science-based organization, we wanted to examine the data more carefully, and so we commissioned IQVIA to look at launch trends in Canada and globally to see if anything has changed in recent years. Unfortunately, as we'll find out from Brad in a moment, the results largely substantiate what we have heard from companies in our survey. So I won't give away any more about the analysis, and I'll hand it over to Brad to present the data.
Thanks very much, Jason. Today I will go into more detail, and I apologize for those that have looked at the executive summary. You will see some duplicate slides, but hopefully you'll also get some more depth and interesting facts that came out of this research as well. So I hope you enjoy the session. First, to start off, I just wanted to introduce the project in terms of what our objective was and how we went about conducting the study. So really, in the context of all of the policy discussion that has been happening over the last year and a half, we really wanted to understand or investigate where Canada stands in terms of new product launches globally. And how does that compare against other countries? And have there been any changes in that status, particularly in recent years? We did this by using our IQVIA global MIDAS database sources over the last 20 years to conduct really a data-driven analysis to understand these trends. The two key questions that we were trying to answer within this was, how does Canada compare to international markets, both in terms of time to launch, proportion of launches, and also sequence in launch? Essentially, where is Canada sit right now in terms of tier status? And then second was, how have we seen any changes in Canada in recent years, particularly in following up with these policy announcements? So in terms of the structure of how we undertook this analysis, the data extraction was a 20-year data extraction. So from January 1st, 2000 to December 31st, 2019, we looked at all new launches within this period across the top 25 countries in terms of sales where data was available. We looked at the key metric of launch date by each and every country for these new active substances. Key metrics within this were place in launch sequence, time to launch by country, time to launch being measured from the first global launch to when a country launches and the time that took, and then also the proportion of new active substances launched by country. So how many global launches does a particular country receive out of that global basket? during our analysis period. We also did some sub-analysis to see if we could understand some deeper trends within this data. So we looked at things like, do these metrics change for, say, best-selling medicines or biologics or oncology therapies and other therapeutic areas? In terms of the data source itself, we used MIDAS IQVIA data. This is the gold standard data set for pharmaceutical sales across the world. It covers 93 countries and is really the most comprehensive set of data available that compares apples to apples in terms of launch dates and availability of medicines across the globe. In terms of the countries that were included in this analysis, I'd mentioned we looked at the top 25 countries by size of the pharmaceutical market, with the exception of 2 countries where the launch dates within those countries was not available or not reliable. And those were namely Austria and Sweden, which were excluded from the analysis due to data quality. In terms of the definition of launch date was defined as the date from which sales first begin to accumulate. So this is the date that products are actually made available in the market, either generated through our sales data reports or that the pharmaceutical company actually reported the date of launch within the data set. So we're dealing with apples to apples definition of launch date across all of these countries. The second definition that I wanted to clarify a bit more is this definition of new active substances. This is our definition of new drug launches. And so these are really new molecules, brand new molecules launched within the time frame of 2000 to 2019 for use in humans, has been approved by a officially recognized governmental body such as the FDA, and is commercially available in at least one of US, Europe, or Canada. We wanted to be consistent in our launch definition. Quite often what you can see in data is that there may be small products that are unique to a particular region or country that only launch in that region or country. We wanted to exclude that noise from the data to get at truly global launches. And so that was our kind of definition of new active substances. We also had a variety of exclusion criteria, removing things like generics or biosimilars. New indications are not included. This is truly the brand new launch. Reformulations as well are not included. So we added several exclusion criteria, again, to get rid of the noise and focus truly on new global launches that we track. We also, when looking at the data, segmented them by therapeutic classes. We chose the top 12 key therapeutic classes by ATC code, and they're illustrated here. I won't go into detail about them, but essentially we segmented them so we could understand in a bit more context in terms of what's launching and how countries fare depending on that therapeutic area. So let's proceed into the results. That was an overview of the methodology. So in terms of the results, I'll show them in 2 key areas. First is Canada's global position in the global launch sequence. So in this area, we're looking at that time to launch proportion of launches, and looking at it by key therapeutic areas, and looking also at the country groupings. Following that analysis of the overall 20-year period, we'll then look at that time series analysis, looking at how have these trends changed over time. So if we start by looking at that time to launch, key metric of time to launch, we used median time to launch here. We also examined average time to launch, but the data in a data set like this is what we call not a normal distribution. You essentially have a very tall peak that trails off over time as you have many outliers on the right-hand side. And from a statistical methodology point of view, this means that a median is a better measure than an average. An average can be very skewed in this sort of analysis, and that is why we chose median for the analysis. And the median is that middle time. So it's the most frequent time to launch that we saw in the data, essentially. And what we see here is that over all products in the last 20 years, Canada was fourth to launch, tied with Switzerland, and just after US, Germany, and UK. US was typically the first to launch country within our time frame, which would probably be no surprise to most. And in terms of Europe, Germany was first to launch in Europe most often, followed by the UK. And then subsequent to that, you have Spain, Australia, France, Italy, Poland, rounding out your time to launch. In terms of proportion, so the second key factor is proportion of launches. So this is how many drug launches does a particular country get out of our entire basket that we saw. And one thing I want to point to first is that the US. The US is the gold standard. We saw a previous slide that they tend to be the first to launch. They are typically the top priority market. But you will see that even in the US, they don't get 100% of launches. You see 89%. So this is really our bar, our top level. And there are various reasons why even the US doesn't get all launches. There can be regulatory reasons. There can be IP reasons. There's a whole sorts of reasons that we did not go into for this study, really just pointing it out to set that top benchmark, which is 89%. Following that, we see that Canada ranks 9th in proportion of launches at 66%, ranking very similarly to Switzerland and Belgium from the last 20 years of launch data. When we look at it across both of these metrics, this is what we're looking at here. We can see actually that those groupings, or if you want to call them tierings of countries, how these countries, similar countries, are grouped together. So on the left-hand side, we have that proportion of new launches from 0 to 100%. And then along the right, we have that median time to launch in terms of years. And we can see a few interesting trends here. First is the first, or the top tier, first to launch countries. This is US, and in the Europe, it's Germany followed by UK. All three of those countries tended, when we looked at them, tended to have some similar characteristics. First, all three of them do have unrestricted list prices. All three are major markets and the top markets in their hemispheres, if you want to say, or in their continents. And they all have a high level of regulatory certainty. So these are the FDA in the US and the EMA in Europe. So these are your first to launch countries. The next group we can see includes Canada. So one thing we noticed was Canada and Switzerland were very similar in terms of their kind of status along this chart. And if you look at Switzerland, there's actually some very interesting commonalities with Canada. They both have independent or unique regulatory bodies, but that are largely harmonized with the EMA and the FDA. They also have robust private insurance markets, which add to their market potential. And both of them also have relatively high list prices, as per other analyses that have done by us as well as others around. We know that both Canada and Switzerland have a relatively higher price. And they also are grouped very close to some other European countries, namely France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. The last thing we wanted to look at was, well, what about the other end of this spectrum? What are some of these countries that don't get launches very quickly or very often, and are there learnings that can be had from those types of countries? So we looked at the end of this spectrum, which was China, and we anecdotally see some other interesting characteristics. It is the second largest market by pharmaceutical size within our data. So it is not an insignificant market, interestingly enough. However, it does have a often cited as complex and unpredictable regulatory environment, which may be one of the contributing factors why we don't see China as higher up on the tier as their pure market size would suggest. So next we looked at the best-selling drugs to see, do we see similar patterns or how might things change? So here we looked at the top 50 best-selling new active substances over the last 10-year period. And we see that actually Canada ranked a little bit better than overall comparing to all drugs. So we see that Canada still ranks 4th, but with a shorter time to launch at 0.7 years from first global launch for these top 50 major drugs. In terms of the proportion of those drugs, we also see an interesting pattern. Canada raised a few ranks within the proportion of drugs received in Canada versus global to 5th at 86% of the top 50 drugs being made available in Canada. Second, we looked at biologics, and we looked across all of the therapeutic areas at all biologics within this study. And what we can see was that Canada ranked 6th in median time to launch at 1.3 years from first global launch. The top US, Germany, UK remained the same. France moved up a little bit in this analysis, but relatively very similar outputs. In terms of proportion of new launches, Canada ranked 9th again, similar to the total market over the last 20 years, although the proportion was slightly lower at 62% of all new biologics, global biologics being made available in Canada. And then finally, we looked at oncology in this analysis. What we saw here was that oncology again ranked 4th in terms of median time to launch for new oncology medicines at 1.1 years from first global launch to Canadian launch. So slight improvement in time and retaining that 4th place in terms of sequence. In terms of proportion of launches, we see that Canada again ranked 9th with a slightly higher proportion than all drugs at 69% of all oncology drugs being made available in Canada. So here we look at overall all the therapeutic areas by these two key metrics that we've talked about throughout the study, the proportion of new active substances or the proportion launched as well as the time to launch. The size of the bubble is the overall size of that market. And what we wanted to do here was to see, does Canada perform better in certain therapeutic areas or worse in others? What we saw here was that the best therapeutic area through these metrics was actually the systemic anti-infectives, where Canada received a large proportion as well as very quickly new therapeutics in terms of systemic anti-infectives. These include things like your HIV medications, your hepatitis C medications. As well, other areas where Canada performed in the upper left quadrant, which was a higher performance with things like respiratory system, oncology, cardiovascular, and several other therapeutic classes. So that was kind of an overview of where Canada has stood over the last 20 years. And next, what we wanted to look at was how has that evolved over time? Has Canada's status within the global launch sequence changed over time? And so here, what we're looking at is the actual sequence and time to launch in Canada over the last 15 years. And the bars represent the median time to launch, and the green represents Canada's sequence within the launches of that year. So in the 2005 period, it took a median time of 1.8 years from global launch to Canadian launch for those products, and Canada was typically 8th in that sequence for that year. And what we see is that over time, Canada has actually gradually improved in its status in terms of the launch sequence or launch tier, from 8th in 2005 to 3rd in 2019, an improvement as well as a lowering of the median time. In the last 5 years, the median time has hovered around 1 to 1.3 years from first global launch to Canadian launch. Next, we wanted to look at was beyond just time to launch for those drugs that did launch. We wanted to understand, well, how many drugs are actually launching and being made available in Canada, and has that changed over time? And what we see here is that annual total of new drug launches year over year since 2005. And what we can see from this graph is that overall, gradually, Canada has received a larger number of new launches year over year, or at least that was the trend up until most recent history. We do see in 2019 that there was a meaningful drop in the number of new launches that Canada saw, dropped down to 13 in 2019. Which was lower than what we've seen in the last 15 years of data. But one of the questions becomes, well, perhaps that's a global slowdown in launch productivity. So we did want to compare that against what we're seeing globally. And so that's what you see with the green overlay here. And what we actually see on the global side is a gradual launch again, or rise in launches again over the last 10 years or 15 years. However, we don't see that decline in 2019. We still see actually a peak increase, although the relationship is a little bit difficult to tell. And one of the reasons we suspect behind that is we know there is a lag between the first global launch and the Canadian launch. We've seen that already from the data. Median time is about 1.5 years, average even longer. So we wanted to do an adjustment to try and compare apples to apples, the global launch to when we would expect to see the launch in Canada. So we actually moved the timeline for the global launches ahead by 2 years to see if we see a better relationship between what we see globally and what we see in Canada. And that's in fact what we saw. It's actually very remarkable, the relationship that we're seeing here between global launches from 2 years ago and launches in Canada. And so we can see in that relationship that over time, when global launches increase, Canada's launches also increase. We know Canada doesn't get all of global launches, but we do see that trend follows fairly closely together. However, we do see that stark difference again in 2019, where we would have expected to see an increase in Canadian launches. We actually see a decrease, and the largest difference of any year in our analysis period, of a difference of 18, a net difference of 18. So that drop in Canadian launches is is actually in contradiction to rise in global launches that we would have expected. So we then tried to dig a bit further to see, well, are there other meaningful trends? And so here we looked at a quarterly basis what we're seeing in launches in Canada. Each blue line is the number of new launches we saw in a given quarter. Now, we're dealing with quite small numbers, and that's why you see kind of a large variation from quarter to quarter to quarter. But I will point out something of note. In 2019, we want to understand, was there any relationship going on here or anything unique to see? And we do see that in 2019, it was the first year where we see 2 quarters where there was only a single drug launch, including the last quarter of 2019. So again, that reflects that there might be something going on in 2019 that has led to a reduction in launches. Again, we're data driven here. We really want to look at the data to understand, are there changes here? And it does look like there's a difference in what we're seeing in 2019 compared to other years. We finally looked at, or tried to look at, what are some of those drugs that have not launched yet in Canada, particularly in the context of the discussions today. We wanted to look at some recent drug launches. So we looked at that 2-year lag. So we looked at all the drugs that globally launched in 2018 to understand what are the drugs that have not yet launched in Canada, and what can we say about them? Are there trends that we can talk about? Some of the things that we did see is the majority of those drugs not launched in Canada but launched globally were in either oncology or rare disease. But we saw launches across, or we saw drugs across a variety of therapeutic areas: anti-infectives, blood and hematology, gastrointestinal, central nervous system, respiratory, the variety of different classes that we saw in terms of launches that did not launch in Canada but launched globally. So that is kind of taking you through the analysis that we did. I'll just leave it with we do have a more detailed summary, which I'll leave with the group. I won't go into too much detail here. We just point out some of those key observations we had in terms of the different, the launch sequence, the therapeutic areas, the groupings, and the sequence over time. But in interest of time, I'll just kind of leave it at the 3 key takeaways from this study, which were as follows. First is we do see evidence that over the last 20 years, Canada has been a top-tier market in terms of time to launch, sequence in launch, and proportion of launches in Canada. We also see that Canada's position has improved over time, particularly with respect to receiving therapies quicker every year. That time to launch has been reducing every year. However, in 2019, we did see early signs of change. We saw a significant drop in the number of new launches in 2019 that could not be attributed to any sort of drop in global launches that we would have expected. And so those are really the conclusions of our study. And with that, I will hand this back to Jason, and thank Jason very much for the opportunity to conduct this study for Life Sciences Ontario.
Well, thank you very much, Brad. Great presentation. Absolutely a great piece of work by IQVIA in terms of digging through this data, and I appreciate the approach that IQVIA took, very science-based, very clear in terms of how they segmented the data in terms of what's in, what's out. And I think it's given us a clearer picture and understanding of what's actually happening in the ecosystem right now in terms of Canadian launches. You know, as I was listening to your presentation, Brad, I have to say it was with mixed emotion. On one hand, I think the data that you present really validates the concerns that our industry put out in our earlier survey. So, but that validation, that sense of validation quickly faded when the reality of what this data means for Canadian patients and for new drug launches in Canada comes into sharp focus. So my first question for you is really around, you know, trying to understand a bit better what goes into the decisions around how these new products are launched globally, and order of launch and the deployment of these medicines. I mean, China's a great example that you pointed out. You would think the second largest market in the world would definitely have a higher ranking. So it definitely speaks to, you know, great complexity in terms of what goes into this. So maybe you could expand on that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great question. And I can expand on it through, you know, experience. I've had experience, you know, within IQVIA supporting launch excellence with my global partners, both representing Canada, but also feeding into global launch strategies. And in my past life, was also involved with global headquarters in the actual launch strategy decision making early on in phase 3 and before. In terms of how companies go about these decisions, you really have to think about it that companies have a finite set of resources at launch and a limited launch window to recoup years of research and usually billions of dollars invested on a certain therapy. From our launch excellence, IQVIA Launch Excellence research, we know that the success or failure of a new therapy is really defined in the first year or two post-launch. Once it's really a make or break within those first couple of years, and launch excellence research backs that up with many examples. So they really only have one shot to get that right. As a result, companies focus on launching first in markets with the best chances of success so that they can quickly start generating revenue before then turning to more challenging markets later on in that sequence. So it's really about maximizing the success early on. So if you add complexity or uncertainty, that really adds cost and it reduces predictability. So that is why you may see that countries with seemingly large markets get their launches much further down the road in the launch sequence, as you know, which would be a little bit counterintuitive to what you would think. But if you're in the shoes of the individual trying to maximize those first couple of years, then with a finite set of resources, it really begins to make sense.
And just to follow on to that, then, I mean, in our conversations with Health Canada and the PMPRB, it's always been their position that the price of medicines really doesn't have a bearing on these launches. I'm just wondering if maybe you could give your thoughts in terms of if that's an accurate statement based on the data that you've seen.
Sure. I mean, from the data, we see that prices do play an important role. Right? A successful launch really boils down to some pretty simple math when you think about it, which is volume, price, and cost of entry. Right? So a good example is to point to those first to launch countries of US, UK, and Germany. All have several common characteristics, including unrestricted list prices at launch. They all have large markets, and they all have a high level of market certainty when launching. And that's why it's really important in these analyses to understand the complex dynamics that go on, not only with launch decision, but the dynamics in each country. Because we know that there are multiple factors at play, and this balance can be really complex, which is why it's important to look at these overall trends and the context at for each country. If you look at only one factor, if you only look at price or only look at regulations or this or that, you can easily come to some wrong conclusions. And it's really important to understand that overall context. And once you do that, you'll see the trends emerge. You'll see that larger market size, predictability, pricing, and market complexity all tend to factor into these decisions. And, honestly, within our research, the research does show that Canada has been a top destination over the last 20 years, and that's steadily improved, despite the fact that Canada, honestly, is a relatively small market compared to some of these other countries. And as well, within the data, we do see there's early signals of change in 2019. So one logically should ask the question, why? Yeah. I guess that's my conclusion on that.
So another question that I have for you, Brad, is we've been hearing coming out of Health Canada that they've actually been receiving more new drug submissions, which is kind of counter to some of the data that was presented here. But I think your data is focused obviously on actual drug launches and sales. I'm wondering if you could comment on that in terms of what the difference is and how it correlates to medicines in the hands of patients.
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question and a good distinction, right? So what we're looking at is real, true launches, right? So there could be an uptick in new filings for Health Canada authorization and new NOCs, but that doesn't necessarily mean a manufacturer has made the drug available to launch in a particular country. So the data that we're looking at is truly when has the product been made available in a given jurisdiction through data. And so you will see a difference between what has been authorized or approved by Health Canada or any other regulatory agency for that matter, and then what is actually made available at your pharmacy counter or in your hospital. And that is what we are measuring, is what is now being made available to the patient.
Thanks, Brad. And I see we've got about 5 minutes left here, so I'm gonna wrap things up for us. I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time today to present this data, for all the hard work that your team at IQVIA has put into this analysis and the collection of this data. I think it's really been an incredible partnership. From a perspective of Life Science Ontario, as I said earlier, we are a science-based organization, and to work with an organization like yourselves that bring the level of credibility and analysis that you have to this data, it's really been a pleasure working with you on this. So thank you again very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure conducting the study.
A few comments just to wrap up. I want to let everyone know that's attending this webinar right now that the notes and the full report deck will be available later this week on the LSO website. So there will be an official launch of this data along with a press release. And of course, our hope is that this data can be used to help inform the ongoing conversation with the federal government around PMPRB. We are entering into a consultation phase. So we hope that this data will be useful as part of that discussion and dialogue as we look to what those consultation outcomes may be in terms of the implementation of these new PMPRB regulations. So with that, I'm going to end it there. Thank you again, and thank you to Diane for kicking things off and moderating today. And we look forward to the launch of this report. Hope it's useful to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We appreciate your time. That brings us to the end of today's webcast. We look forward to seeing you again.